something we have to consider as part of the discussion is recognising the strengths and weaknesses of our own work. There is really no such thing as a perfect study. There are always inherent issues that arise, and it's incumbent upon us to state those, because remember, the whole thing about science is, one, avoiding ambiguity, but two, honesty in what we have done. Too much of what goes on in science is really about smoke and mirrors, and particularly in science going back 30, 40 years, where science wasn't open to scrutiny. Now science is open to scrutiny because we have what's called open access, where anybody can download the papers, but also because the material appears online, platforms through Twitter and conversation and so on. So you have to be honest about the strengths and weaknesses of your own study. So what does that kind of look like for us? Well, it's much easier to obviously acknowledge study strengths, but we have to be objective about this, about our findings. So you have to acknowledge both the strengths and the weaknesses, but what strengths could there be? So think about the things that make it work well. Have you had just a better choice of research question? Has there been a more stringent selection of an appropriate study population? So in other words, actually, is the issue in all the other studies that have gone on is that they've never really taken homogeneous groups? That's very possible. Is it that the approach that you've taken is much, much more applied? So the intervention is more applied, is more relevant to what actually happens in exercise practice. So maybe that you're comparing and everybody else has done the data collection in the laboratory and yours is the first study to go into the field. That is a real strength. Is it that you've been using more sensitive measures, either in terms of the testing modality, but also maybe in the kind of the statistical analysis that you have carried out? So again, a real strength. But you can only understand these strengths, for example, sample size and approaches to minimize bias. You can only understand these if you have read the literature. But yet understanding your strengths is really important, because that's what makes your study stand out. Have you done things which make your work stronger than what else has been published? And that you may not feel that is necessarily possible to write about for maybe, say, a second year piece of work. But for your undergraduate project, for example, you would absolutely anticipate that there are real study strengths in what you have done. The sample size is a really obvious one, that very few studies use what's called a power calculation. Very few studies actually work out how many participants were needed to actually show a statistical change. If you do a power calculation beforehand, you can work that out. But too often we are not prepared to acknowledge the weaknesses in our own work. So no study is perfect. So there are going to be limitations. And for example, limitations could be the sample size. Maybe actually after all, you tried to do power, which was, you tried it, but actually you didn't hit the sample size. Or maybe your demographics don't reflect the general population. Maybe you've just got all males and no females. Maybe actually in hindsight your research design wasn't appropriate. Maybe you didn't use, I don't know, a crossover design or a double-blind design. If you want to know more about those, go and watch one of the other videos on research design. Maybe there's issues in the protocols that you've chosen. Maybe you didn't control things. Maybe there wasn't calibration. So you have to acknowledge study weaknesses, because that's actually good science to be able to do that. It shows a degree of reflection in what we do. Now, I'm going to show you an example of this. It's a very brief example, but I'm going to show you an example of this in the report that we've been focusing on in all these videos. So in here, there is a very brief mention of a weakness. However, the recovery between trials was not controlled for, which have impacted on the development of fatigue. So this is in the study here. So in the context, it's referring to the fact that fatigue is a fundamental factor. It's acknowledged that the recovery between trials was not controlled for, which therefore may well have impacted upon the outcome of the study. Now, this is a very brief recognition of weaknesses, because this is a 1,000-word report. But in something like a major project, where you've got 8,000 words to play with, you would expect to see more detail in that kind of limitation or that weakness. So don't be frightened to acknowledge weaknesses. It's not actually a poor reflection on what you have done. It's acknowledging good science, but at the same time recognize if there are strengths in what you have done. So for example, you might want to write the strengths in this section here. You might want it as a kind of the strengths of the study. That'd be quite unusual to do. So are the strengths within the study here? Well, they're actually cited. In the current study, calibration was a function of the dimension of the phalanges. However, it's conceded that the dimension of the hands were not controlled for, as highlighted by Clerk and Adams, potentially impacting on the veracity of the data. So this is really interesting. There's a play going on here. That the first part is suggesting that other studies had not applied controls. So a strength of the studies was that calibration was controlled in relation to the dimension of the phalanges, but at the same time, it is conceded, therefore we've got a weakness here, that the dimensions of the hand were not controlled for, as highlighted by previous work, potentially impacting on the veracity of the data. And so this teaches a lesson that you don't have to just have weaknesses, which is kind of limitations, at the end of the report. They should really be embedded in as you're going along. So remember to think about the strengths and the weaknesses for all aspects of what you are reporting.